The apartment was stripped bare. The couch was gone. The bookshelves were empty. The walls, once covered in photos of anniversaries, trips, and forced smiles, were wiped clean. But it wasn't the emptiness that made my stomach drop. It was the envelope on the kitchen counter, my name written in the careful, precise handwriting I had once loved. My hand shook as I tore it open. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. A deep ringing filled my ears. This isn't sudden. You just never wanted to see it. I've been planning this for a long time. The words blurred. I braced myself against the counter, forcing air into my lungs, but my body felt like it didn't belong to me. My eyes snapped to the bottom of the letter, where her signature sat neatly above a single line that shattered everything. My lawyer will contact you soon. I barely had time to process before my phone buzzed violently on the counter. Unknown number. I already knew who it was. I answered without thinking. Hello. A clipped, professional voice. Mr. Carter, I represent your wife in the divorce proceedings. You should have received the letter by now. Divorce proceedings. Not a divorce. Not discussions. It was already done. My throat closed up. My wife had left me. My wife had planned this for months, quietly untangling herself from our shared life while I still believed we could fix things. The lawyer didn't care about my silence. The terms are straightforward. She retains the house. Your accounts have been divided per agreement. You've received your portion already. I yanked my phone away from my ear, pulled up my banking app with numb fingers, and felt the last breath of normalcy collapse inside me. $600. $600. That was all I had left. She had drained everything. Something inside me snapped. She took everything. How the hell is that fair? A pause. A dry, impersonal tone. She handled the finances, Mr. Carter. You signed the paperwork over a year ago. My own signature. My own blind trust. My own goddamn fault. The phone slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the counter. My pulse thundered in my ears as I took in the stripped apartment, the letter, the mocking emptiness of my bank account. I had given her everything, and in return, she had erased me from our life like I was a stain she was finally able to scrub out. I staggered backward, my heel colliding with something on the floor. I looked down. A chipped ceramic mug. It was the only thing left. A twisted laugh crawled up my throat. She had taken everything we built together, but she hadn't bothered with this. I picked it up, fingers curling around the worn edges, and a memory slammed into me so hard I almost dropped it. I had bought this mug in my 20s. Before her. Before I became a man who sacrificed himself in the name of love. Back when I lived by the coast and spent my nights painting until my fingers ached. I had given that man up for her. Given up everything that made me just to fit into the mold of the perfect husband. And now, the person I had spent years trying to be enough for had stripped me of everything and walked away without looking back. I gripped the mug so hard my knuckles turned white. I had nothing. No wife. No home. No money. No purpose. But maybe that was exactly what I needed. I grabbed my phone with a newfound steadiness, my hands no longer shaking. I opened my email, found my resignation draft, the one I had typed 100 times but never had the courage to send, and, with one last breath, I hit send. Then I turned, walked out of that empty apartment, and didn't look back. I didn't remember walking to my car. I didn't remember turning the key in the ignition or pulling out of the parking lot. But suddenly, I was on the highway, the city shrinking behind me in the rearview mirror. The resignation email had been sent, the apartment was empty, and my bank account was a joke. There was nothing left to keep me here, nothing worth salvaging. Every part of the life I had built had been hollowed out, and the only thing I felt now, beneath the shock, the anger, the betrayal, was a quiet, searing clarity. I wasn't going back. The highway stretched forward in an endless, gray expanse, but I knew exactly where I was headed. A coastal town 3 hours away, one I hadn't thought about in years. It was where I had lived before my life became a checklist of obligations, before I let someone else dictate who I was supposed to be. I had left that place chasing stability, believing that sacrifice was the price of love. And now, driving with nothing but a half-empty gas tank and a $600 safety net, I realized just how little that sacrifice had been worth. My phone buzzed in the passenger seat. I glanced down. Unknown number. I knew exactly who it was. I let it ring. It rang again. And then again. With a sharp breath, I yanked the phone up and answered. What? A voice, smooth and impersonal. Mr. Carter, we need to discuss the legal proceedings. I hung up. They could have the house. They could have everything. I didn't want it. The next 2 hours blurred into a monotony of road signs and gas stations, my mind bouncing between the rage burning in my gut and the cold realization of what came next. I had no plan, no job, no backup, only a destination I hadn't seen in over a decade and an instinct telling me to get there before the weight of everything crushed me completely. The coastline finally came into view as the sun dipped low, the air shifting from the stale scent of city smog to the crisp bite of salt and brine. I took the exit, muscle memory guiding me through the familiar streets, past the battered storefronts and weathered docks, until I found myself parked in front of a small, run-down motel. The neon vacancy sign flickered against the dimming sky. I stepped out of the car, stretching my stiff legs, and walked inside. The air smelled like cheap coffee and something vaguely medicinal. A woman behind the counter looked up from a crossword puzzle, her expression flat and unreadable. Need a room? Just for a few nights. I pulled out my wallet, trying not to wince at how light it was. How much? $50 a night. I slid my debit card across the counter. She swiped it without comment, handed me a key, and returned to her crossword like I had already ceased to exist. The room was exactly what I expected: stained carpet, a bed with sheets so stiff they looked like they had been ironed straight from the factory, and a bathroom with a flickering light bulb. But none of it mattered. It was mine, and for the first time in years, I wasn't sharing my space with anyone who expected something from me. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the peeling wallpaper, and exhaled. Then, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't an unknown number. Eric. I hesitated before answering. Jesus, man. I just heard. His voice was tight, urgent. Where the hell are you? Out of town. No shit. Your job called me. Said you quit. Said they can't reach you. What the hell is going on? I ran a hand down my face. I walked into my apartment today, and everything was gone. She left. Took everything. Lawyer's been calling me all day. I had $600 in my bank account. A long silence. Then, a quiet curse. She drained you. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. She planned this for months. I didn't see it. I didn't want to see it. Eric exhaled sharply. Where are you staying? Some motel by the coast. I'll figure it out. You don't have a plan. No. Another pause. I know you, man. You're sitting in that shitty motel room thinking about how you let this happen. You're thinking about every sign you ignored, every compromise you made, and you're blaming yourself for all of it. I swallowed hard. Eric's voice dropped, steady and sharp. Listen to me. She made her choice. You can either drown in it, or you can start over. But you don't get to sit in that damn room and act like your life is over. You hear me? My grip tightened around the phone. You don't get to let her win, he said. Not like this. I didn't respond, but something in my chest shifted. Eric sighed. Look, if you need cash, I can help. No, the answer came fast, automatic. I'll figure it out. Then do it. His tone was firm. Don't just sit there. I hung up without another word. The motel room was silent again, but something inside me wasn't. I stood, grabbed my keys, and walked out. The air was cold against my skin as I made my way down the street, past the empty storefronts and flickering streetlights, until I reached the docks. The ocean stretched out in front of me, vast and endless, the waves crashing against the worn wooden planks. I reached into my pocket, fingers brushing against the cool metal of my wedding ring. For years, I had worn it like armor, like proof that I was someone's. Proof that I had built something worth keeping. But it had never really been mine, had it? It had been hers. The life I had built, the person I had become, it had all been for someone else. I pulled the ring off, held it between my fingers, and stared at it for a long moment. Then, without hesitating, I threw it into the sea. It disappeared beneath the waves, swallowed whole. I stood there for a long time, the wind cutting through me, the weight on my chest finally lifting. I didn't know what came next. But for the first time in years, the answer didn't terrify me. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of pounding on my motel door. For a moment, I didn't move, staring at the cracked ceiling, my brain caught between the haze of exhaustion and the sharp edge of reality. Then, the knocking came again, harder this time. I forced myself up, my muscles aching from a night of restless sleep, and swung the door open. A man stood there, arms crossed, his face lined from too many years in the sun. He wore a faded work jacket, oil-stained jeans, and had the kind of expression that suggested he had no patience for small talk. His eyes flicked over me, unimpressed. You Carter. I blinked, still half asleep. Who's asking? Eric sent me. I gritted my teeth. Of course he did. The man sighed, clearly annoyed. He said you needed work. Said you'd lost everything and weren't stupid enough to sit around feeling sorry for yourself. Was he wrong? I stared at him, my jaw tight. I didn't like being someone's pity project, but I had no job, no money, and no time to let my pride get in the way. What kind of work? I asked. Dock work. Fishing crew. Not easy. Pays cash. You in or not? I didn't hesitate. I'm in. Good. Be at the docks in 30 minutes. He turned without another word and walked off. I shut the door, exhaled sharply, and ran a hand through my hair. My body was stiff, my mind still tangled in everything that had happened, but this was something real, something I could hold on to. I grabbed my jacket, shoved my wallet into my pocket, and left the motel without looking back. The docks were already alive with movement when I arrived. Men loaded crates onto boats, voices shouted orders over the hum of engines, and the sharp scent of salt water mixed with diesel in the air. The man from earlier, who I learned was named Don, barely acknowledged me before pointing toward a rusted-out trawler with faded blue paint. That's yours. You listen, you work hard, you get paid. You don't, you're gone. Got it. I nodded. Got it. The next 8 hours were brutal. The work was relentless, hauling ropes, gutting fish, stacking crates, my muscles screaming with every movement. The sun was unforgiving, the waves rough, but none of it mattered. For the first time in years, my mind wasn't drowning in thoughts of what I had lost. There was no time for regret, no space for anything but the task in front of me. By the time we docked, my hands were raw, my clothes soaked with sweat and seawater. Don handed me a wad of cash without a word. I took it, nodding in quiet thanks, and made my way back to the motel. My body ached with exhaustion, but it was the kind of pain that felt earned. As I stepped into my room, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I grabbed it, expecting another call from the lawyer. Instead, a name I hadn't seen in years stared back at me. Samantha. My chest tightened. I hadn't spoken to her since before I met my wife, hadn't allowed myself to think about what we were, what we could have been. My thumb hovered over the screen before I finally answered. A breath, then her voice, hesitant, careful. It's been a long time. I swallowed hard. Yeah, it has. Eric told me you were in town. A pause. Told me what happened. Of course he did. I exhaled slowly, gripping the phone tighter. I'm fine. You don't sound fine. I let out a dry laugh. What does fine even sound like? Silence. Then, softer this time, why didn't you ever call? I closed my eyes. I thought I was doing the right thing. By disappearing? By choosing a life that made sense. Another pause, heavier this time. And did it? The answer sat on my tongue, bitter and undeniable. No. She sighed. Meet me tomorrow. Noon. The diner by the boardwalk. I hesitated, then nodded, even though she couldn't see me. Okay. The line went dead. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, the weight of everything pressing down on me. The life I had built was gone. The woman I had sacrificed everything for had erased me without hesitation. And now, a past I had buried was pulling me back in. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, I wanted to find out. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the stiff motel mattress, staring at the ceiling, my mind cycling through everything that had led me here. The betrayal. The empty apartment. The job I had walked away from without a second thought. The weight of it pressed against my chest. But beneath it, something else was stirring, something restless, something that didn't want to sit still anymore. By the time the sun rose, I was already up, my body sore from the previous day's work, my hands aching, but I welcomed the pain. It was real. It was something I could hold on to. I pulled on my jacket, pocketed my cash, and left the motel without hesitation. The diner by the boardwalk was exactly how I remembered it. Same rusted-out sign, same peeling paint on the windowsills, same smell of burnt coffee and fried food seeping through the cracks in the door. The bell above the entrance jingled as I stepped inside. The place was nearly empty, the morning rush long gone. My eyes swept the room before landing on her. Samantha sat in a booth near the window, her fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee, her gaze fixed on something outside. She looked the same sharp eyes, same quiet intensity, but there was something in the way she held herself now, something heavier. She must have felt me watching because she turned, meeting my stare without hesitation. I walked over and sat across from her. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it carried weight. She took a slow sip of her coffee, setting it down before finally speaking. You look like hell. I let out a breath, shaking my head. Feel like it too. Her lips twitched, but she didn't smile. Eric told me what happened. I nodded, not trusting myself to respond. She leaned forward slightly, her expression unreadable. So, what now? It was the question I had been avoiding. I had no plan, no direction, just a need to keep moving. But for the first time, I said it out loud. I don't know. She studied me for a long moment, then reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook, flipping it open. You still paint? I blinked, caught off guard. No. Why not? I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair. Didn't have time. She tilted her head slightly. Or maybe you just didn't let yourself. I clenched my jaw. I had a life, Samantha. And now you don't. The words hit harder than I wanted to admit. I looked away, my fingers tightening into a fist on the table. She wasn't saying it to be cruel. She was saying it because it was true. The life I had built was gone, and all that was left was me, someone I hadn't thought about in years. She slid a folded piece of paper across the table. There's an art studio near the docks. The owner's looking for an extra set of hands. Nothing fancy, just setting up, cleaning, helping with classes. I told him about you. I stared at the paper. Why? Her gaze didn't waver. Because you need something that isn't just running away. I let out a slow breath, my fingers brushing against the paper but not picking it up. You think I can just walk in there and start over? I think you can stop pretending you don't want to. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I wasn't thinking about what I had lost. I was thinking about what I could still take back. I took the paper and put it in my pocket. I showed up at the studio the next morning before the sun was even fully up, standing outside the locked doors, my breath visible in the cold air. The docks were already coming alive, boats shifting in the harbor, workers shouting, the smell of fish and salt mixing in the wind, but the studio remained dark and silent. I waited, my hands in my pockets, the weight of everything pressing against me again. The ring was gone. My old life was gone. My bank account was still nearly empty. And now, I was standing outside some rundown art studio, hoping that manual labor would keep me from drowning in my own head. Alan showed up 10 minutes later, eyeing me as he unlocked the door. He didn't say anything, just jerked his head toward the inside. I followed him in, rolling up my sleeves before he even had to tell me what to do. The work was brutal. I scrubbed paint off tables, sorted through dried-out brushes, moved heavy crates filled with supplies that felt like they weighed as much as I did. My hands were already raw from the docks, my back aching, but I didn't stop. I didn't want to stop. Stopping meant thinking. Thinking meant remembering. Halfway through the day, Alan walked over, watching as I lifted another crate onto a shelf. You always work yourself into the ground? Or is this something new? I set the crate down harder than necessary. I do what I have to. Alan leaned against the counter, arms crossed. You don't have to prove anything here. Just do the damn job. I exhaled sharply, wiping sweat from my forehead. I'm not trying to prove anything. He snorted. Sure you aren't. Then he nodded toward the back of the studio. Grab that box in the storage room. It's marked canvas. I walked toward the back, my muscles aching with every step. The storage room was a mess, shelves stacked with supplies, half-finished projects covered in dust. I found the box and reached for it, but as I did, something caught my eye. A painting. It was shoved between a stack of old frames, barely visible, but I knew that style anywhere. I pulled it out, my breath catching in my throat. It was mine. One of my old paintings, from before I had given it all up, before I had buried that part of myself so deep I had almost forgotten it existed. The colors were faded, the edges torn, but it was unmistakable. I heard footsteps behind me. Alan stood in the doorway, watching me. Didn't think you'd find that. I swallowed hard, gripping the frame. Where did you get this? Samantha. His voice was unreadable. She brought it here a long time ago. Said you'd come back for it one day. My chest tightened. Why? Alan shrugged. Ask her. Then, after a pause, you were good. Damn good. I clenched my jaw, shoving the painting back where I found it. Doesn't matter. Alan watched me for a long moment, then nodded toward the box I had come to grab. Get back to work. I lifted the box and carried it out without another word, but my hands were shaking. I didn't go back to the motel that night. I walked instead, aimlessly, through the streets I hadn't seen in years, my mind caught in a storm I couldn't quiet. Seeing my old painting buried in that storage room had ripped something open inside me, something I had spent years suffocating under routine and responsibility. Samantha had kept it, had brought it to Alan's studio, had believed. What? That I would one day come crawling back. That I would wake up one morning and remember who I used to be. I didn't need saving. I needed a way forward. And right now, I didn't know what the hell that was. The town had changed in small ways since I'd left. New businesses, fresh coats of paint on old buildings. But it still held the same weight, the same quiet pull that had always been there. I found myself near the docks, the scent of salt and oil thick in the air, my feet dragging to a stop in front of a bar I hadn't thought about in years. I hesitated for half a second before pushing the door open. The place was dimly lit, filled with the low murmur of conversation and the occasional clatter of pool balls. I took a seat at the bar, ordered a drink, and let the burn of alcohol settle the noise in my head. I was halfway through it when someone slid onto the stool next to me. "You look like hell." I didn't have to turn to know it was Samantha. I exhaled through my nose, setting my glass down. Seems to be the popular opinion lately. She flagged down the bartender, ordered a whiskey, and leaned against the counter. "You saw it, didn't you?" I tensed. "Yeah. I thought you'd be angrier." I turned my head slightly, meeting her gaze. "What do you want me to say, Sam?" "That I appreciate the reminder of everything I threw away." She didn't flinch. "You didn't throw it away. You walked away. There's a difference." I clenched my jaw. "It doesn't matter, doesn't it?" She took a slow sip of her drink, watching me over the rim. "I didn't bring that painting to Alan's place because I thought you'd come back. I brought it because I thought maybe, one day, you'd remember who you were before you started living your life for someone else." Something inside me twisted. "And what if I don't want to remember?" Her expression hardened. "Then you might as well go back to whatever life you ran from, because standing still isn't going to fix anything." I hated how easily she saw through me. I hated that she was right. I finished my drink in one swallow and stood. "Good talk, Sam." She didn't try to stop me. I walked back toward the motel, my fists clenched at my sides, my pulse hammering. Every step felt heavier, like I was dragging something behind me, something I had been too afraid to look at for years. I had spent so much time trying to build a life that was steady, predictable, safe, and in the end, it had been torn out from under me like I was nothing more than a placeholder in someone else's story. But standing in that storage room today, staring at the painting I had abandoned, had made something clear. I wasn't going to be erased. Not by her. Not by myself. Not anymore. And if that meant burning everything down and starting over, then so be it. The next morning, I walked into the studio before Alan even showed up. The key was under the flower pot by the door, exactly where he had told me it would be if I ever needed to open up early. I let myself in, flicked on the lights, and stood there, staring at the rows of canvases, the unfinished sculptures, the walls lined with art created by people who had chosen to be here. My hands curled into fists as I thought about how easily I had let go of this part of my life, how willingly I had let myself become nothing but a shadow in someone else's world. I had told myself that sacrificing my own wants was the price of love, that if I just gave enough, I would finally be enough. But the truth was simpler than that. I hadn't lost myself because of my marriage. I had given myself away, piece by piece, year by year, until there was nothing left. I grabbed a blank canvas off the shelf. My movements were automatic, instinctual, muscle memory kicking in before I could second-guess myself. I set it on the easel, found a set of brushes, opened a jar of paint. The first stroke came stiff, my grip too tight, my hand unsteady. The second was easier. By the third, the rest of the world had fallen away, and there was nothing left but me and the work in front of me. I didn't hear Alan walk in until he cleared his throat behind me. I turned, expecting him to look irritated, but he just stared at the canvas, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, finally, about damn time. I exhaled, setting the brush down. "It doesn't mean anything." Alan raised an eyebrow. "Sure it doesn't." He nodded toward the rest of the studio. "You planning on working today, or should I start paying you to paint instead?" I hesitated, but he was already walking away, calling out orders to the others who had started filtering in. I looked back at the canvas, at the first real thing I had created in years, and something in my chest loosened just slightly. By the time the day ended, I was exhausted, but for the first time in weeks, it wasn't the kind of exhaustion that felt like I was drowning. I walked out of the studio, the night air cold against my skin, and headed toward the boardwalk. The ocean stretched out in front of me, dark and endless, the waves crashing against the shore. And standing there, like she had been waiting for me, was Samantha. She didn't say anything at first, just studied me the way she always had, like she could see straight through every excuse, every lie I told myself. Then, finally, she spoke. So what now? I let out a slow breath. I don't know. She nodded, like that was the answer she had been expecting. Good. I frowned. Good. You spent your whole life making choices based on what everyone else needed. Now, for the first time, you don't have a plan. That's a start. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel the weight of who I had been. I felt the possibility of who I could become. I didn't know what came next, but for the first time, that didn't scare me. I wasn't expecting the letter. It was waiting for me when I got back to the motel, tucked under the door, my name scrawled across the front in handwriting that was instantly familiar. My stomach twisted as I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. No return address. No indication of what was inside. But I already knew. I sat on the edge of the bed and tore it open. The first line hit harder than I expected. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to say it anyway. My hands clenched the paper, my pulse hammering in my ears. The words blurred together for a second before I forced myself to keep reading. I didn't leave because I hated you. I left because I couldn't be what you needed anymore. I know you think I took everything, that I planned this to hurt you, but that's not the truth. The truth is, I was drowning in the life we built, just like you were. The difference is, I had the courage to leave first. I swallowed hard, my jaw tightening. You wanted so badly to be the perfect husband, to build a life that made sense, but in doing that, you erased yourself. And I let you. Because it was easier. Because I thought maybe, if we both ignored it long enough, we'd eventually believe in it. But love doesn't work that way. And I think, deep down, you always knew that. I stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. My entire body was tense, my mind racing through every moment I had spent trying to hold things together, every sacrifice I had made to keep something that had never really existed the way I wanted it to. I forced myself to read the last lines. I hope, wherever you are, you're finally living for yourself. Because that's all I ever wanted for you. And if you ever come back, I hope it's not for me. I hope it's for you. I let the letter fall to the table. My hands were shaking. Not from anger. Not from sadness. But from something else entirely. I had spent so long being bitter, so long feeling like I had been wronged, that I had never stopped to ask myself if she had been right. If maybe, just maybe, she had done the thing I was too afraid to do. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't sad either. I just felt done. I grabbed my jacket, shoved the letter into the trash, and walked out the door. The motel room, the past, the version of me that had spent years trying to be something I wasn't, it could all stay behind. I wasn't carrying it anymore. I had a future to figure out. And for the first time in my life, I was ready for it.